So thanks everyone for joining. I'm here to welcome David Diaz. He is a PhD student in the School of Forestry. Was it Forestry and Aquatic Sciences? Forestry.
Environmental and forest sciences.
Environment and Forest Sciences. Thank you. And it seems like he was very interested in environment all the way down. You did environmental history at Harvard for your bachelor's. You did soil science at Oregon State for your master's, and then now you're here at UW. So that's really awesome. And I met him first when he was in my class in the fall, CS 583, working on a Python package to do kind of, I guess, measuring trees based on their shape in a forest setting, which was really cool. And I'm excited to see what he's going to talk about today. And I'm sure it's super interesting, and I hope that it really helps you guys that are interested in data science see kind of some of the breadth of data science being applied to different sciences and domains. And I think he's a great person, so it should be a good talk. All right, well, thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming out today, including those of you who are getting credit for this. So I'm wearing two hats. I'm a PhD student here as well, but I'm also the director of forestry technology at a nonprofit called Ecotrust. So I have the privilege of having support both from being a grad research assistant and working part-time during the school year. So if you can swing that, totally do it. It's a fantastic deal. But so a lot of the work that I'm doing kind of weaves those two things together. So research and development that I've been doing here at the University of Washington, and more of the applied work that I get paid to do at Ecotrust. Okay. Does that sound a little better? Okay, so there's a couple controlling themes that I'm going to talk about that are going to come up throughout the presentation. The first one is that we've got a huge amount of data that's just bombarding us right now. And the amount of data and the computing power that's shown up has kind of enabled this whole new suite of algorithms to work. And so we've gone from predicting things at a much higher accuracy than we've ever done before. And so we can do things like we do a lot of things that we really care about, like identifying where cats and dogs and ducks are in pictures. And one of the things that I think you'll gather, coming through this course in particular, is that when you can abstract your problem, away from your domain, you can see that actually learning how to identify dogs, ducks, and cats in pictures is actually a really useful thing. And so I'm going to talk today about doing that in forestry. But one of the things that comes up with this kind of data-driven paradigm now is that most of the predictive power that we have is largely constrained by generating good data to learn from. Okay, another thing that's come up quite a bit is that these revolutions in predictive abilities and new algorithms and things like that are really based upon these canonical data sets. So here's a couple examples of the handwritten digits data set called MNIST and ImageNet. And so now you can usually find different machine learning algorithms that have been pre-trained on these algorithms. And everyone uses these canonical data sets as benchmarks to say, I've beat state of the art now, look at my algorithm, I'll publish a paper. All right, so getting over to forestry, there's a basic premise here that there's something worth learning about how forests grow and change over time. Okay, there's a huge amount of data that's being generated about forests, and if we can actually translate that into information, we get accomplished some good things. And we have a lot of forest data, like I said. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three different research projects that I'm working on here, and we'll just go through them one at a time. So starting off with seeing trees. Has everybody in here heard of lidar? Anybody not heard of lidar before? Okay. So it deals with lasers, okay? And so this is what lidar looks like. Okay, so you fly an airplane and you're shooting a laser at a mirror that's oscillating, and everything that it hits on the ground reflects back, okay? So you end up getting a three-dimensional point cloud that comes out of that. That's kind of everything that the laser hit, all right? So this is there's a huge amount of lidar being captured now, and there's a lot that we can learn about from forests. And maybe we'll get to sharks later. But okay, so in forestry, the primary avenue that this type of data is coming in is that people are trying to predict what forests look like all across the landscape. So usually the way this is done is that you generate these maps based on remotely sensed data, and you use each pixel in that data, or whatever your unit of analysis is going to correspond to something that you measure on the ground. Okay, so traditionally, a lot of agencies would actually go out and do, I've got several 100,000 acres of forest land, I'm going to put a grid out on that and sample the forest on that grid across the whole forest and do some basic statistics and say what's the average stocking of Douglas fir that I have across this forest, for example. Most agencies now, for example, I'm showing plots that have been installed by the Bureau of Land Management, Washington Department of Natural Resources, and the U.S. Forest Service, are transitioning to leveraging this remotely sensed data. And so each of these agencies has installed plots specifically for the purpose of relating it to what they can see from the sky. Okay, and on each of these plots, they measure where every single tree is and a lot of attributes about those trees. Okay, so the basic recipe is that you measure these plots on the ground. This is what lidar point clouds look like, and so you can see lots of detail in there, but it's just a mess of XYZ coordinates and an intensity value that gets returned from the sensor. And so one of the things that goes on here is that you collect remotely sensed data and you collect the tree level data on the ground that you've measured. You build a model that relates those two so that you can then just predict in the areas where you haven't measured the trees on the ground, what does the model think is actually there, okay? Now one of the important things here about actually identifying where the individual trees are is that a lot of these plots are not 1 hectare like this big circle is, okay? Most of the plots that are actually implemented in the field are a much smaller area than that. And so once you actually start zooming into these smaller plots that are being measured, getting that plot in exactly the right location so you can build this relationship with what you saw from the air really matters, okay? So there's been some research already demonstrating how far off your predictive models can get if you just punch the hole in the wrong place out of this point cloud. Okay, so the basic idea is that you want to have some way to do what's called co-registration. So I want to say I've measured these trees on the ground, I've seen some points from the sky, can I actually make those line up better than just whatever I get from a GPS unit out in the field? And so one of the benefits that you'll get out of this is that I can actually now have a quantitative way to do co-registration. So right now, if any of these agencies do have a process for doing this, it's a human being moving a plot on the ground and saying, okay, I think it looks like this, like it's right here, okay? So it's something that takes a lot of time to do, and the closest thing to quantitative approach to that I've seen is that the analyst will give a rating to say like, oh, this really lines up well, or oh, I have no idea where this plot is, on a sliding scale like that. So the other thing that we can do here, obviously, is that if you can line up your data that you sense from the air and that you measured on the ground better, your models will get better. Your predictive models will get better. You'll build a tighter relationship between what you want to predict and what you observed from the airplane. And what's also really cool about this is that there's a huge amount of data that's been collected the old-fashioned way before people started thinking about relating it to what you can see from the sky. So like I said, you put a grid out there and you walk around. If you take a GPS unit, that would be an exception. Normally what you're doing is you're pacing. Okay, so I'm going to pace 660 feet, and I'm going to measure another plot, and then I'm going to pace another 660 feet and put down another plot. And so we have a huge amount of data that's been collected, orders of magnitude larger data sets than we have these precise plots from, that we don't quite know where those plots are. We have a general idea of where they are, but they could wobble. If you were trying to build a relationship, it wouldn't be tight enough right now to get a lot of good data out of it. And then the other idea here is that you can build one of these canonical data sets now. If you can actually co-register a lot of point clouds with a lot of plots, you can build a big data set that a lot of people can compare each other against. So the research questions that I'm working on for this is a lot of the measurements that are collected, we know are collected with error. Like I said, we have a GPS measurement, for example, that says, I think the plot's here, but there's some error based on where the satellites are that it might be within 5 or 10 meters, right? So you have this idea that the measurements that were actually collected in the field are not perfect. And so what that allows you to do in a Bayesian context is to say, there's some uncertainty associated with all of the things about where that plot is. It's not completely random. It's random within some distribution that you can define, okay? So the basic idea here is that you could use some type of Bayesian approach to minimize the distance between what you saw on the ground and what you saw from the air, okay? One of the other questions is, and we'll get to this in the next slide in a little more detail, but there's a lot of parameters that we can use to actually describe what trees look like. And as you get more detailed, does it actually make the models perform better, or does it just make the models fit slower? There's a couple different ways that you can describe this as an optimization problem. One is in 2.5 dimensions, which is basically saying it's like a raster, or where you've got x, y coordinates, and at each one of those coordinates you have a height value. So it's still a 2-dimensional array, but there's another way that you could do it, is actually just try to fit things in full 3D, right? So the question is, does actually adding that extra dimension give you a lot, or does it just take a longer time to fit? And what we obviously want to know about as well is how well does this work in different forest types? So in forests that are very heterogeneous, where you've got one big tree and nothing else around it, it's probably going to be pretty easy to find the plot, right? But if you're in a Douglas fir plantation and all the trees are exactly the same height and size and they're all crowded together, maybe you're not going to be able to actually recover where the plot is. But that's also interesting to know. We'll cover that in a little bit, why that's interesting to know. So the other aspect here is that we have a lot of plots that have missing data. So like I said, we have these plots where either there was no plot location explicitly recorded, or the locations of the trees aren't recorded, but you just know that these trees were on that plot somewhere, right? So there's an opportunity to recover that information by saying, this looks like there's a tree here that was on this plot, and now I can actually describe where the coordinates of the tree are, what its shape is, things like that. And then does it matter, does it actually change how good your predictive models are if you do co-registration or not? Okay, so the way co-registration has worked in the literature so far, and this is in forestry, there's much smarter co-registration approaches that have been done in like self-driving vehicles and things like that. But so this is what state-of-the-art in forestry looks like right now. So basically you fit you get a surface, a crown surface, or canopy surface. It's derived from that point cloud. So you can imagine just like putting a blanket over the point cloud, and that's a canopy surface model that you would get from lidar. And then you can simulate trees. And so the basic approaches now have been simulate a tree that's perfectly straight up and that's symmetric in every direction, okay? And then what you do is you create a new surface, you simulate a crown surface from that, and you move these two surfaces around until the difference between them is the smallest, right? So this is that 2.5 dimensional problem like I was describing. You've just got these two canopy layers that you're trying to minimize. Okay, so I'm going to show you what building a flexible crown model looks like. And this was the project that I did in Bernice's class last quarter. And let's see, okay. So this is all Python. It's all, you can run this on Binder as well. If you guys have used Jupyter Notebooks before, you can pull this up and play with your own trees as well. So the basic idea is that you have a geometric model that is very plastic. You can move it in all different kinds of shapes. But each one of these is just some really gnarly matrix multiplications and things like that that are going on that allow you to say, I can move the X location of my tree, for example, or the Y location of my tree. I can make it higher or lower off the ground. You can make the tree taller. Crown ratio describes how much of the tree does the crown actually occupy. So for example, the crown recedes or the crown gets further towards the base of the tree. Right now, the way I have the tree leaning is that there's a couple different ways you could think about this, right? You can imagine if a tree leans that the crown goes like this, or that the tree is actually leaning like that, but the crown is still upright, right? And so the idea there is that there's a couple different ways to do this, and this is the way that I've implemented it right now, is that when I change the direction of the lean, for example, it's just moving the tree around in a circle, right? But right now the crown is still upright. So this is just telling you that the top of the tree is leaning away from the bottom of the tree, but the crown is still upright. So some of the other cool stuff that we can do, with each side of the tree, we can make it bulge out. And then we can do things like say, how high up the crown is its highest point. And then for each part of the tree, we can also say, how concave or convex is it, right? This is a bunch of parameters now for every single tree, right? No, very few of these things are measured in the field. You'll commonly have the tree height and the crown radius. So we're trying to infer these parameters for lots of trees that have been measured where these attributes weren't actually recorded. And what you can do with that then is generate a map that looks like this. So this is 12 hectares of forest, so there's about 5,000 trees in there. This is just using a default paraboloid as the shape. But you can, each one of these trees has its coordinates actually measured. This is a research forest where they actually send out grad students and other folks like that to measure the locations of all the trees, and you can imagine how much fun that is. And so these are just colored by species right now. So each of those trees is it's a different color, it's a different species. But you can imagine now wiggling all of those crowns until they actually line up with the point cloud really nicely. So that's the basic idea. Here's how I'd actually describe it in terms of getting something more like an algorithm. And so the first point is that we want to get away from the point cloud to a surface. And so the way that we can do that is generate what's called a Poisson surface mesh. So that's this guy right here, circulating in the middle. And then we can actually define this generative model, right? So we can describe, what do I think trees look like? And then we can calculate the distance between what I've simulated and what I observed, right? So we start wiggling these trees. And we adjust those parameters for the trees until the distance between this mesh and the simulated trees is the smallest, okay? And you can do that in a couple ways. You can do that to where you can pretend like everything you measured was exactly perfect. And so you come up with a single answer that says this is where the plot is, or this is the best fit for the plot. The benefit of doing the Bayesian approach for this is you can say, this is the most likely place of the plot and how confident I am about that. And not just how confident I am about where the plot is, but whether or not I can actually tell all these other things about trees. Can I tell whether these trees are leaning or not? Do I have any confidence in those parameters or not? Okay. Yeah, one kind of trick here in terms of computing is that calculating the distance from points that are randomly assorted in XYZ to other points that are randomly assorted in XYZ can take a long time. So there's kind of a trick here, which is fitting a grid first. So you do a mesh like this one here in the middle. This is before I'm actually doing any optimization. And then I put this grid of points that are evenly spaced out there. And for each one of those points in that grid, I calculate how far am I from the mesh. So then when I'm actually running the optimization now, I'm not calculating how far I am from some random points on a mesh that I don't know exactly where they are. I say I can immediately tell where the nearest point in this grid is and just tell me how far that point was from the mesh. Interpolation, 3D interpolation, or grid interpolation. So that's a SciPy. It's a SciPy module that you can use just for that. Okay, and so you wanna test how well this works, and so we kind of I'm inventing some stress tests, to see, can I recover plots based on increasing error. So we have all these plots already where we know pretty precisely where they are. So if I start moving the plot further away, can I actually recover it, right? Similarly, if I have a plot that was measured but the locations of the individual trees on it weren't recorded, can I unscramble their location, actually find out, yeah, the plot's here and this is where the trees are? Because I know they occur within a certain radius of that plot, right? All right, and then we also want to get information about how good of a fit are we getting and how certain are we about that. And the basic way to do that is to evaluate whether or not it affects your algorithms is I'm going to be using random forest, which is, I don't think it's just because forest is in the name, but it's really popular in forestry. But to train 3 different random forest models to see how big of a difference this co-registration works. And so the first is train a random forest model that just uses the original GPS-based plot locations, right? The other is these adjustments that have been made by humans. And then the third is the adjustments that are being made by this algorithm. And you want to identify which of these predicts things better. So did I spend all this time doing a chapter in my PhD just to find out that it didn't make a difference? And for each one of these sections, it kind of follows a similar theme. Publish the data, publish the models, publish the software, okay? So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but one of the really cool things that I'm excited about with this is that each one of these agencies is collecting thousands of plots, and none of them are using the data that the others are collecting, okay? So even just the basic step of taking the data from each of these agencies and putting it in a single repository that's formatted the same way will allow everyone then to use models that are either pre-trained on that data or to train their own models if they want. But you can also imagine something now where there are millions of trees that have been recorded in these plots. And so if you can actually co-register them confidently, you will now have point clouds for millions of individual trees. And so hopefully this isn't something I'm going to get into as part of my research before my PhD, but you can then imagine something to where you can feed a streaming point cloud to an algorithm and it identifies what tree you're looking at, okay, because you've got millions of examples to learn from. Okay, so that's all the tree level stuff, seeing individual trees, and now we can talk about zooming out and seeing forests. And so this started with my work at Ecotrust. So about 5 years ago, we launched a web application called Forest Planner. Most of the work that we've been doing at Ecotrust is primarily trying to enable ecological forestry with the basic theory of change that most landowners have a variety of management objectives that they're trying to hit. Usually it's not only producing timber and making money off the land, and oftentimes those values involve a pretty significant land ethic about doing right by the land and passing it on to the next generation in good shape and things like that. But most of the foresters that are out there actually helping landowners make plans and things like that were trained in a previous generation where your goal was to get a job in the industry, which is essentially farming trees. Farming the same tree, making them all look the same. And so there's a lot of disconnect between the way foresters have been trained up until fairly recently and the needs for family landowners. And they own about half the land, half of the private land in Oregon and Washington. So there's a lot of them out there. And this was the first web application we have seen that kind of puts this choose your own adventure type of thing into a landowner's hands. So the basic idea was a landowner could log on to this application. It's free. They find their property, map it out, say what type of forest they have, and say what happens if I manage it this way or that way, right? And one of the bottlenecks that we were noticing was that most of the landowners were not even trying to get into scenario planning. They were trying to fill out a forest management plan, which is usually taking stock of your resources and identifying what your goals are, okay? So figuring out what if I do this, what if I do that, that's kind of down the road. And most of the landowners that we were talking to couldn't define in quantitative terms what their forests look like, okay? So they couldn't tell you how many trees there are, how big they are, things like that, other than very hand-wavy, types of things. And so a lot of the power of this decision support technology could only get opened up if you could actually say what your forests look like in quantitative terms. Okay, so we wanted to close that gap. We wanted to identify, using this kind of swimming pool full of data, what type of forest we're looking at, and do that job for the landowner so they don't have to come up with that information on their own. And so the way that we're looking at that now is using image segmentation and region merging to essentially automate drawing of what we call forest stands. There's a lot of work like this that's already been done, but one of the things that is usually a problem is species identification. So particularly with lidar, just hitting something and getting its three-dimensional structure will tell you a lot about how big the trees are and how many of them there are, but it's not so good at telling you what species you're looking at. And that is a huge driver of all types of forest behavior, which species are there and how they interact with each other. And so hopefully we can actually use a lot of this explosion in particular of satellite imagery, but also of climate data to actually use time series information to see how trees are changing over the course of the season and start to identify species. And then there's a couple benchmarks right now. There's one called Landfire and one called Gradient Nearest Neighbor, or GNN. And in particular, we're focusing on segmenting and labeling forest stands. So each forest stand, you can think of it as a management unit. And what we want to do is draw these boundaries and label them in a modeling sense. And what we label them with are things like, what's the dominant species? You know, we can say it's a Douglas fir western hemlock mix, for example. We want to know about how big are the trees. So we can say they're 10 to 15 inches diameter. And how much canopy cover is there? And is it one story or is it multiple stories of canopy, right? So these are all things that is the bare minimum of what we're trying to get at. So there's a lot of work that's been done to try to predict things that are much more granular scale, you know, trying to get timber volume and things like that. We're setting the bar pretty low, okay, of just getting these basic forest types, because this is what needs to go into a plan. You don't need detailed timber information or anything like that to write a plan. So what we have to work with now. So we still have all those lidar plots, and we have a whole bunch of lidar data covering about half the region. Now this is where it starts to get to that order of magnitude more, right? So we've got from Washington Department of Natural Resources and Oregon Department of Forestry, we've got 369,000 polygons. Instead of 2,000 plots, we're now talking about hundreds of thousands of polygons. And at least in the case of DNR, this image, this aerial image here is showing you how those polygons have changed over time. So this is, that area has been managed, and when they go in and do some management, they redraw the polygon. So you've got these kind of repeated measurements now that you can start to learn from there. Within these polygons, we've got a whole bunch of plots that have been measured. But again, these are the ones where we don't know quite where they are. Now, they gave me a GIS layer, you know, that says this is where the plot is, but the plot's not really there. It's probably somewhere near there. Okay. So we want to generate some features that our model is going to learn from, learn to predict those forest type attributes with. And so we have the lidar data, like I described. And so for most approaches that use lidar data, you're not using the raw point cloud. You process the point cloud and generate derived products out of it. And so usually this is flattening things into 2D or 2.5D, where you generate these rasters that have either a 1 meter pixel size or 10 meter pixel size, and you calculate a whole bunch of different things about it. So what's the distribution of points, that fall within that pixel, for example? So we've also got downscaled climate data. So this starts to give us this time series information that we can get on a monthly, seasonal, or annual, both historically as well as climate projections in the future. Okay, and then we've got imagery. Right now we're doing all of our image processing on Google Earth Engine, and we're using aerial imagery and satellite imagery from both the Sentinel and Landsat satellites. And one of the things that we do here is that we can extract for the plots as well as the stands average values, right? So we can say what's the average red band value from the Landsat, for example, but we can also, over the course of the polygon, we can calculate a histogram of those values. And so both of those are things that we can use in different stages of the process of labeling forest stands. So this is the basic approach. You start with those plot scale predictions, or plot scale information from those lidar plots, and for each pixel, you say, this is what I think is there just based on the lidar data, okay? So this starts to give us some basic information about what's on the ground, but we want to try to start blobbing that together into forest stands, right? So we've got a whole bunch of different layers here. So this is showing the aerial imagery. This one in the top right is the canopy height model, so the height above ground. This is showing intensity, so how strong was the laser return. This one's canopy cover, and you can see the pixel size here is a little bigger, right? So one of the things that's interesting here is that you can start to get neighborhood information, and not just this very high resolution information like this color image. And we can do like hill shades of the terrain. And I want to say that this picture here is like what proportion of the points in the lidar fell within 10 to 20 feet, right? And each one of these kind of makes a different, just looking at it, you can see each one of these different lenses that you put on makes a different area of the image pop, right? So by stacking all of these together, hopefully the idea is that you can actually discriminate between forest stands pretty well. And because we have way more data than we want to work with to actually drive this segmentation, we can use something called linear discriminant analysis to cut down on the number of variables that we're using. So this is, if you've heard of principal components analysis or things like that, this is the supervised, flavor of it. So basically we say, we have these labels for each of those polygons, those forest stands, that says it's Douglas fir Western hemlock mix in this size and, that canopy cover. And it will transform your predictor variables to maximize the separation between your classes, okay? So it's kind of a helpful way to do your dimensionality reduction if you actually have labels already for the things you're trying to predict. So the basic idea is that we apply that transformation, and then we start doing this graph-based segmentation and merging things together, okay? And once we've got those things merged together, then we make predictions about what's inside them. So to kind of illustrate that, this is a few stands that have been drawn by Oregon Department of Forestry. There's some interesting human artifacts that you see in here, for example. Where, apart from just drawing edges, imprecisely, one of the things that you can actually see here is my best guess is that this is a riparian area, a stream, where there's buffers under forest practice rules that you can't clear cut all the way up to streams, for example. And in both Oregon and Washington, there are rules that when you do a clear cut, you have to leave a certain number of trees per acre, right? So the way that's commonly done is that you leave those trees at the edge of the unit. And the reason that you do that is that normally, for example, you might leave trees on the edge of this unit. And then when you come by 10 years later and you clear cut that area, you take those reserve trees when you clear cut the next area. So this may or may not actually reflect a real forest type break, right? This is an artifact of the way the laws work and the way people leave trees on the ground. But so you get some of these interesting artifacts that come in that you may or may not want to just, for example, use semantic segmentation from a neural network, for example, because you might run into a lot of edge problems like this, where the edges aren't defined really well, and there's these things that get included in different stand types, even though they're not actually part of a different stand type. Okay, so we start from that. We want to get back to those stands, and so we start with a canopy height model, and in forestry, we often call these tree-associated objects. In computer vision, these are often called superpixels, but the basic idea is that we want to go from this perfectly square grid of pixels to blobs of things that are actually more meaningful. And so we start with this canopy height model, and we can perform a segmentation on it. Essentially, there's one called watershed segmentation, which you can imagine like pouring water from underneath this surface and seeing which basins fill up. Okay, so now we've got these things. We call them tree-associated objects instead of trees because it might be multiple trees, right? You might be actually capturing 2 or 3 trees that are really close together. There are trees in the understory that might not be reflected in this. But so this is our basic unit. And so what we can do now is for each one of these tree objects, we can say, give me the red value from Landsat. Give me the lidar value for the proportion of points from 0 to 5 feet, et cetera. And we kind of can make each tree object look the same. So the algorithm's not going to spend any time trying to split trees in half or anything like that. This is the smallest unit that it's going to split into different management units. And then we can calculate distances between each of these trees. So this graph-based segmentation is basically, you can imagine each one of these trees being a node in a graph, each other tree that it's adjacent to being another node in that graph, and those nodes in that graph are connected by an edge whose distance is one of these transformed, metric distances. It's not actually how far in XY space do I have to walk to get from one tree to the next. It's how far in red space and blue space and near infrared space are these 2 blobs from each other. And if they're close, lump them together, all right? And you can set thresholds. I want each of my polygons to be at least this big. And so you start to get to things that resemble forest stands. So all of this merging was just done on the canopy height model, just to illustrate it. But you get these interesting artifacts, for example, like this kind of cauliflower or like intermingling stuff going on there. We don't want that, right? A forester would never draw that, wouldn't draw a stand like that, okay? So this is one of the things that I'm hopeful that once we actually get to the point where we're using this, these large or neighborhood type pixels that tell you within 10 meters, what was the canopy cover? That starts to introduce for each one of those trees that's smaller than that, I'm like the tree next to me because we have the same canopy cover, for example. So you start to get some pull that will hopefully avoid this kind of intermingling of stands there. We've got funding from the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Oregon to pilot test this. So right now, we're digesting a bunch more data than just shown under these blue footprints here. But this is where we're actually going to be generating maps for landowners. And so that should be wrapping up this fall. And what you do with that is that we're developing another application that's kind of like the on-ramp for Forest Planner called Land Mapper. And the basic premise there is click on a tax lot or draw a property boundary, and it will automatically generate your forest type map, your soils layer, your stream layer, all these things that are the basic ingredients for forest management plans. You know, it's just about 2/3 of what goes into a forest management plan is go look this up and write it here, right? It's not tell me what you want to do or anything like that. It's like, go get your soils data from NRCS and go get your stream data from Oregon Department of Forestry and copy and paste it into this Word document. So that's something that hopefully we can streamline quite a bit. And of course, you publish and document the data, the models, and the software, right? So you want to be able to have all the raw data so that people can train their models, we'll produce the maps of the forest type predictions that we get, and then you know, demonstrate how the models work, allow other people to reproduce them, and there's a couple software packages that are coming out of this. One that I would put a plug in, if any of you guys are doing geoscience work and are running into computing problems in terms of can't fit things into memory, things like that, there's a really cool platform that's sprung up within the past couple years called Pangeo. And basically, if you can define a pipeline of analysis in Python, Google essentially just throws free compute at you. And so this will spin up to, I think, more than 100 virtual machines for you and just process stuff for you. So it's a great way to actually do this kind of large-scale analysis, and it's free. Okay. All right, last step, seeing the future. We're wanting to predict what happens with climate projections and how forests will respond. And the best information that we have for this right now is a growth and yield model that's called the Forest Vegetation Simulator. So this is what forest managers use to try to do operational scale planning. So this, let's see, this is 2010. They used random forests to predict how trees respond to climate and shoehorned that into this growth and yield model to say how well will trees respond to this. And so this is what originally motivated me to come to do a PhD here, was that we published a couple reports like this where we were evaluating for the Bureau of Land Management. They were redoing their management plan over about 3.5 million acres of forest land in Western Oregon. And they had someone who was doing their timber projections, but they weren't thinking about climate. And they had someone that was doing habitat projections that was thinking about climate. And they said, well, can somebody actually tell us whether or not we'll be able to hit our timber targets if climate change gets really bad? So we kind of took this model out for a spin, and it was terrible, okay? It was doomsday. And I'll give you a kind of quick glimpse of that. A kind of a cautionary tale about when people say random forests are immune to overfitting, don't believe it, okay? What we're looking at here is each one of these points on the map is a forest inventory plot that's been measured by the Forest Service. And if it's blue, it means that a western hemlock tree was observed on that plot. And if it's orange or gold, whatever the other color is, it means that a western hemlock tree was not observed on that plot, okay? So these researchers, Crookston and colleagues, fit a random forest model to try to predict presence and absence of trees, right? Based only on climate data, right? So one of the key things that pops up here is that you notice it fits really well, right? So this kind of gray area is where the model predicts suitability, climatic suitability for a tree, okay? So if the map is white, it means the climate doesn't support the species here. This green line that you're seeing here is where, in the 1970s, this is one of these traditional species distribution maps that was drawn based on people actually going out on the ground, knowing where the trees grow and things like that. And so one of the things you'll notice here at this north end of the map, you've got this big white spot with some of these orange dots inside of it where there's no western hemlock observed. That's the Willamette Valley in Oregon. There's a reason that there are not a huge number of trees in there. Does anybody know what it is? It's some of the most productive farmland in the Pacific Northwest, okay? So all of that area is cultivated, That's why you don't see western hemlock trees there, okay? But the random forest model is only learning, I don't see trees here, and the climate looks like this. So therefore, the climate doesn't support these trees. Not a good way to do it. So what ends up happening then is that your model learns, for example, that the climate in the Willamette Valley doesn't support the species, and then in the future, if the climate anywhere else starts to resemble that of the Willamette Valley, it's going to start killing trees. So this is this current suitable range up here on the top. And then we did this for low emission scenarios and high emission scenarios, but there are 4 different circulation models that were used to generate these climate futures. And so what we're showing here in this bottom graph is how much those different models agree when we apply the random forest model to it. Do they agree that the climate's going to be terrible? That's what that purple color is, unanimous agreement, unsuitable climate. If there's disagreement, you've got yellow, et cetera. And so basically what this model was predicting was within 50 years, western hemlock would be gone from the Oregon coast and would be gone from most of the Cascade Range in Oregon. Okay, so we shared this with the silviculturists, the forest managers at BLM, and it doesn't even pass the sniff test, okay? So this is just completely unrealistic. So another example closer to home, I do a lot of work at Pack Forest, which is forest land managed by the university near Mount Rainier. And I just grabbed some numbers from my advisor, and it predicts that within about 10 years, Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar will actually be pushed to extinction locally because the climate won't be suitable for them. Those species occupy pretty much 90% of what's there in the forest right now. So this just doesn't pass the sniff test. Okay, so we can do better. So basic questions are, there's some things that we want to predict, and we want to use some machine learning and hierarchical Bayesian models to do that. And we want to beat the benchmarks for each of these, and we want to try to weave together a variety of different types of data to do this. So one of the issues that came up with that random forest model is that the climate that it was learning from for those trees spans a 30-year window, right? So they just took climate data covering the region for the past 30 years, right? But the trees that are there have lived through a lot more than that, right? So there's just a lot of examples where they're fitting a really tight model to data that doesn't really describe why the trees are there and when they wouldn't be there, okay? And so you fit a model and then project the future, right? So now we've got some more data that we can work with. These are forest inventory plots that have been collected by the Forest Service. So that's this U.S. Forest Service FIA program. And then we've got other plots that are research-oriented plots, these P&W PSP. And then the really cool thing that I'm excited about getting into is tree ring records, okay? So this is where we don't have inventory plots going back very far. I mean, these research plots, the P&W PSP plots, are some of the longest running plots that we actually have. But there's not very many of them. And what we do have, though, is a similar number of tree ring records that have an annual record of how much each one of those trees grew over time. Okay, so we can start to relate a lot of different things to climate like that. Okay, so the basic modeling problem is, given a list of trees that are on a plot right now and some climate data that describes the recent past and the future, I want to predict how many trees are going to show up next, so how many trees naturally regenerate, what species are they, and then we want to predict for each one of those trees that's currently on the plot, how much bigger does it get, is it going to die, et cetera. And because I like Bayesian statistics, I want to do this probabilistically so that I can say, yeah, I think the forest is going to look like this, and this is how confident I am about it. All right, so there's two approaches. One is bend the growth and yield model to make it work, right? So this is one of the easiest to implement and distribute, but it's basically, there's existing parameters that you can adjust the growth and yield model on your own. And so it's basically just fitting a model that tells you what those numbers should be. And the other is, a couple years ago, they produced a few new APIs for the growth and yield model to where you can stop it, and using Python or R, you can say, okay, I'm going to take the data out of this model, run something else, come back in and just replace what that model thought was going to be there. Okay, so the adjusting approach, there's a couple examples and recent research, including one of my advisors on my committee, Eric Turnblom. And the basic idea there is that you take an existing growth and yield equation for how much a tree grows in diameter, for example, and you just add some new parameters for precipitation and temperature, or some derived factor that gets at that, like a drought index or growing degree days or something like that. And then you train a model to predict what you want, growth, mortality, et cetera, validate it on some held out plots, and then we have these completely independent data sets as well that we can test them on too. Okay. And so we can adjust these things in a Bayesian context where we can do what's called partial pooling. So the basic idea is that right now the way the model works is that for each region in Oregon and Washington, there is an equation for Douglas fir small trees and an equation for Douglas fir large trees, and they're all calculated independently of one another, right? But I would argue knowing how Douglas fir small trees respond to climate is probably interesting and informative for how large trees might respond to climate. And similarly, knowing that other species that need a lot of light, for example, and struggle with competition, like Douglas fir, having information about other species might actually tell you something about Douglas fir as well. So the basic idea is that you can say each of these model parameters is not independent of each other, right? You fit them from some parent distribution in Bayesian lingo. And so you can describe these relationships in terms of tree sizes. That's the kind of bottom layer here, getting up in the different individual species, lumping species together into species groups, and then geographically. So you start geographically, now we're talking about things that are like populations of trees, right? So you're starting to get at something that might be a proxy for genetics or things like that. And so for each one of these, you'll still generate a parameter for the growth of each tree and the mortality of each tree, but it's influenced by its neighbors in this hierarchy. And we can fit the tree ring records first. So we can say my first guess at what these things are, what I believe trees respond to climate like. I can, before I even look at any inventory data, I can just say, how did the tree rings tell us that trees respond to climate? And that's my first guess. Okay. All right, now we can get into the black box or machine learning work here. And so there's a couple different approaches, right? The adjust one, where we can go into scikit-learn and fit Gaussian process regression. And there's a cool package I just found called scikit-garden, which basically extends scikit-learn. And so one of the examples, to make some of these models probabilistic. So some of the times if you use scikit-learn, most of the models will have a predict proba method on them. Some of them don't. This introduces them for some of the models, right? So now you can generate a random forest and also get these estimates about the probability of the predictions from them as well. Okay, so you can do that for adjusting parameters and then just, like I said, dumping out the model, scraping all the data out of it, predicting what you want, and then piping that right back into the